You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. It's been a while since we last had Josh Safrin with us, but he has a fascinating story, and he wrote a book a while ago called Free Spirit, Growing Up on the Road and Off the Grid. I guess you call literally off the derech, off the beaten path. His mother was a witch. He was raised to be a warlock. Now he's a Yidlock, spellbound by Judaism. Josh, welcome back to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov to you. So tell us, you have a fascinating story, and I know that we had you a while back with it, but I'm intrigued by it. So you were born to a mother who was a witch, correct? And not
Correct. Yeah, I was born into a coven of witches, which is a minyan of witches. 13
and witches that you were born into, or
I was born into a witch collective, a coven is what they call it, in San Francisco in 1975 in the Haight-Ashbury. And my mother was part of a group of women that were going to reclaim the goddess from the patriarchy and overthrow the U.S. government in the process. And didn't work out the way they planned. And part of their plans were dashed when I came out a boy.
Because they only wanted girls, right? And here you are, a boy.
Right. That's right. That was problem number one for them.
Was your mother disappointed? Was your mother disappointed that it was a boy?
I think so. She had a long name picked out for me if I was a girl that included the name Rivka, which was actually one of our ancestors who was like a folk healer from the shtetl somewhere. And then when I came out and she saw that I was a boy, actually, interestingly, when she heard I had a very loud cry. And so the name that came to her was Joshua, from the idea of Jericho and the noise crashing the walls down. And so she came up with this name Joshua, but it was just sort of a single name. Hadn't been expecting it. They had all predicted that I would be a witchling, which means a little witch. And so right away, I think the fact that I was a boy kind of created a little bit of a schism in that community. But then they decided, well, I could be a warlock, which was the like a male witch.
Now, you grew up, did you know anything about Judaism? Did you know you were Jewish?
No, had no idea, didn't know what it was. I mean, I knew that my mother's mother had a funny accent and spoke the funny words sometimes. But it wasn't until I was basically in middle school that my mother and I were living on the side of a mountaintop with no running water and electricity, no toilet.
You lived a really commune life. It was like a communist, like a socialist life, right?
Totally. And at this point, eventually we ended up at a real commune, also off the grid with no running water, electricity, when I was about 12. And this is when I was about 9. It was just the two of us in this tiny, funky little cabin, barely insulated, with an outhouse outside and everything. And there was a guy from Seattle who had a vacation cabin sort of down the trail, and he had a telephone. And that was a big deal. So one night my mother wanted to make a call to someone, and we went down, we knocked on the door and said, hey, can we use the phone? And the guy started talking to her, and he said, you're Jews, right? To my mother. And she was like, yeah, how did you know? And they started talking, and I had no idea what they were saying or what he was even asking her. And then he said, where are you from? And she said, oh, we're from San Francisco. And he said, ain't no Landsman from San Francisco. Where are you really from? And my mother thought that was the most hilarious joke. And they talked about faraway places and strange words and foods. And it turned out later, talking to my mother, this guy wasn't even Jewish. He was an Italian guy who had grown up in New York City. And at one point in the conversation says, I was the only Italian kid in Brooklyn that had not one, but 2 bar mitzvahs. And my mother thought that was hilarious. So it wasn't until we got back into the green mist of an evergreen forest, climbing back up the trail, and I was like, did you know that guy? I mean, who was that guy? How did he know all this stuff? And it just blew my mind that.
How did he know your mother was Jewish? Did she look Jewish? So she didn't sound Jewish, or did she sound Jewish?
She did sound Jewish, but believe it or not, it was he looked at me and he said, yeah, he looked at my mother and he said, your kid's got a rabbi's nose. That's how I could tell. And
So
yeah.
where's your father in all of this?
My father was a kind of a surfer poet guy, not Jewish, who was just sort of hanging out in San Francisco writing poetry, and he showed up long enough to help conceive me, and then kind of went on his way. So he was never really part of the picture.
Have you ever tried reaching out to your father?
I have, yeah. I've met him, and it's a funny thing. I mean, he's like, oh, great, nice to meet you. And then he's gone on his way. He's not particularly interested. I have 3 daughters and they're living their lives, and so he's sort of doing his thing. He now plays the oud. He's a Middle Eastern musician, strangely enough. And we're a little bit, I mean, he's definitely has a very sort of, I think he would call sort of a pro-Palestinian perspective, which I don't know why that would affect his relationship with me, but I think it does in part.
He probably views you as an Israeli settler.
Yeah, I think he probably does. And I think that also helps him with whatever residual, guilt he might have about not having been there as a father, which is just, oh, this is some Zionist, guy, so I don't have to care about that guy.
When was the last time you tried reaching out to your father?
I have never reached out to him. He reached out to me about 5 years ago. I'm a lawyer by day, and he reached out to me and I had a legal question for me, and I was like, yeah,
he didn't support you, but he wanted free legal advice.
Exactly.
I hope you charged him.
No, I was just like, I don't do that kind of law. Good luck.
And that was it. He hasn't since.
Yeah.
How sad. So what was like growing up with the coven of witches? When mother was a witch, what was it like? Were you treated well, okay, abused? What was it like?
Yeah, I mean, I think my early years, when you're a little kid, you don't understand that there could be anything different. So I have fond memories of running around barefoot and unrobed, and just not having several different kind of mothers available, and all kinds of freaky people coming and going, and a relatively happy time. And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan got elected, and my mother knew that nuclear war was going to break out. There had been the 3 Mile Island disaster, and she was just confident that we had to take to the hills. And so that's when life really changed, and we started just sort of hitchhiking and traveling around, living in vans and buses and teepees and tents all over the American West. And that got uncomfortable. I mean, we'd be snowed in some cabin, and have nothing to eat.
Electricity.
No, just a wood stove and a bag of rice and a bottle of vitamins to get through the winter.
How did your mother support herself? How did she support you?
Well, so ironically, for someone who wanted to smash the government, she was on welfare at a time when she got like $200 a month on this welfare check that was sort of, if you played it right and walked and hitchhiked and rented little garbage cabins, she could make ends meet. And then she was always she was a visual artist, a sculptor, and she was always trying to, we would show up at like the logger rodeo where people are selling, homemade ammunition and propane tanks, and my mother was trying to sell, like, I made this medieval chalice with the tree of life growing, and she would sell a piece of clay here and there, but it just was a total mismatch for where we were.
I could imagine. It must have been hard on your schooling too.
Yeah, so that was the thing. I didn't go to school. My mother sort of looked at me and thought, schools are no place for kids. That was literally something she said. Schools are a place of competition and violence and capitalism. So she was going to teach me everything that a growing boy needed to know. Poetry, the Communist Manifesto, how to fashion a menstrual sponge out of, garden supplies, whatever she was going to teach me. That's all I needed to know. And it wasn't until I got around the age of 6th grade, about 10 years old, that I was like, I'm going to go to school. I can see that
you wanted to go to school.
I wanted to go to school.
Did you have
And
any friends?
not right away. I mean, I was at this point, we were squatting on an island. My mother had partnered up with a Marxist guerrilla commander from El Salvador who was also a violent alcoholic. So, life got very dark at that point. And
Did you have any problems with this individual, this violent?
oh yeah. I mean, he was very abusive toward my mother. He passed himself off as he was also a shaman and a poet and a healer and all these other things, but he was basically a violent alcoholic. That was his day job. And
did he abuse you as well?
He there was lots of emotional and he was a military man, right? So he was going to toughen me up and make me do sit-ups and push-ups and punish me and all these kind of things. But the abuse didn't really turn to me until I was about 12. And that was a moment when I was at an age where I was like, I'm going to stand up and protect my mother. And when I stepped in to protect my mother, then, I got the beating that was coming to me. He punched me in the face and I was bleeding, the whole thing. And luckily for me that was an inflection point, because in my mother's mind, it was somehow okay for him to beat her. That was part of their complicated relationship. But when it turned on me like that, it was like too much. And we fled in the middle of an afternoon and hid out in a family's basement for a summer, worried that this guy was going to find us. And then we made our way to this commune. This is when I was 12 in Skagit County, Washington, in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. And again, started over, no running water, electricity, toilet, refrigerator, built a cabin out of scratch and lived there until I went away to college.
Now, you mentioned that at one point you discovered you were Jewish because this man told your mother that she looked Jewish, you look Jewish. So Judaism seemed to have some influence on your mother, because you mentioned that she was going to call you Rivka and she called you Joshua based on Tanakh, on the Bible. So aside from that, were there any other manifestations of Judaism? And what happened after you discovered you were Jewish? What effect did it have you at that point in time, or did it have an effect?
Yeah, so it's a funny story. Believe it or not, it involves the Holy Book. It involves the Tanakh. We were shopping at a thrift store. My mother was the only person I ever knew who bought books at thrift stores. Everyone else bought, like sensible work pants and boots. And, my mother would go for the books. And, a wildly pagan woman. And I looked over and she had this blue JPS Tanakh, which is what it looked like it said to me, Tanach. It had some foreign lettering on it. And I picked it up and started flipping through it. And I was like, is this like a Bible? Why are you buying this Bible? It was so weird. And she was like, well, it's the Jewish scriptures, the Holy Scriptures. And in this community, we were in a very sort of, I guess nowadays you'd call it kind of red state, but it was a very sort of fundamentalist Christian area. She's like, in this community, if the wrong people find this book, they'll burn it. And we have a duty to protect this book.
But I thought she was against God. She wanted to bring the goddess as opposed to God, right?
Yeah. I mean, which is why that moment for me was so powerful, because
how old were you at that point?
She had an inner Pintele Yid, some drive within her that she was like, well, in this, we have to protect this Tanakh, And so we had this Tanakh, and it was in our milk crates of books around a fire. I never would open the thing. She would never open the thing. It was just there. And she dated for a time this sort of like Rastafarian Mennonite guy who made me a mixtape, and it had a bunch of reggae music on it. And I was stoking the fire, and I was singing Bob Marley, and I sang this: "The stone that the builder refused shall be the head cornerstone." And my mother goes, "Oh, that's from the Tanakh. That's the Psalms." And I was like, no. This is like Bob Marley roots music. It doesn't have anything to do with weird Bible stuff. No. And she picked up the book and handed it to me. And at that point, I was, whatever she was for, I was against. So I knew she was wrong. And I went found the book of Psalms, and began reading through it in English just to disprove her, And I had to get past Psalm 100 before I realized oh yeah, there's the lyric. And along the way, there's like half of all the other Bob Marley lyrics. And so to me, that had this profound effect because it was the Tanakh wasn't coming from my mother or from somebody, it was coming through Bob Marley, and who was a hero of mine, whose music moved me. And I was like, well, if it's good enough for Bob Marley, maybe I can look at this too. And then I I go turn to the beginning of the book, and it says in the beginning, and I'm like, well, that's a way to begin a book.
Okay. How old are you at this point in time?
At this point, I'm probably about 13 years old, and I really the stories in Bereshit, those Genesis stories, just really resonated with me. And there was some commentary in the book, and I got to the Abraham part. He was like, he grew up with idol worshipers and felt like this calling that. And I was like, yeah, I grew up with literal idol worshipers too. Like, how many of us have there been in the last few thousand years?
Did your mother try putting any spells on you?
Well, my mother eventually caught wind of sort of what was happening. So I then went to once I was sort of armed with this, I'd asked my mother, what does it mean that we're Jews? And my mother's response was beautiful, which is, we're Jews, like Freud, Einstein, Marx, we're Jews. And I was like, we're related to them. And she gave a good Jewish response. She was like, I don't know, we should go to the library and look it up. So that was my first connection after that Tanakh, was going to the library and just reading every book I could get on interlibrary loan or whatever. And so I'm reading about Maimonides and all these other, and I just had like this spiritual connection. And part of it was I felt like my own history was in a way Jewish history, and this wandering and going from place to place and never looking for trying to get back to some ideal, some utopia that we've been chasing. And also all of that resonated. And at a certain point, my mother kind of figured out what I was doing. I taught myself to read Hebrew phonetically
By yourself. Nobody helped you.
Nobody helped me. There was no one. I mean, there was no one around. And then I was confused by the CH for the chets and chafs. I didn't know whether it was cha or what, But so I was, and I learned the Shema, because one of the books that I said was like, the Kriyas Shema is the thing you got to say. So I was like, this thing is short. It's like one line. I'm deciphering it like a code, and I'm saying that. And my mother, at a certain point, she talks to me and she goes, you're subscribing to a rule-based patriarchal religion. And I thought about it, and I was like, I grew up without any rules, and I grew up with no father. So that sounds right. That sounds, yes.
Sounds good.
I'm interested in that. Bingo,
And that is Josh Safrin. As you heard, his mother was a witch. He was a warlock, and he ended up becoming a Yidlock. And we're looking at his fascinating story here on the Talkline Network.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
And we're back. Our guest is Joshua Safrin Esq. He wrote a book a while back called Free Spirit, Growing Up on the Road and Off the Grid. His mother was a witch. He was born to a coven of witches. He was trained to be a warlock, and today he's a Yidlock. So, Josh, you were exploring Judaism. You went to the library. So what happened next? You taught yourself Hebrew. You taught yourself the Shema. Was your mother happy at all that you mentioned that she didn't like the fact that you were going to a structured religion where there was no structure in your life, and here this is some structure. So what happened?
Yeah, she was, at that point in my life, the fact that my mother was unenthusiastic about it was helpful, because I was for sure going to follow up on it. It's a weird, coming back, a weird Baal Tshuva process, because since there was no Jewish community where we were, or any Jews, again, I'm learning from the library. And as I'm reading through Jewish history, I get to the Holocaust, and it's like, oh man, I can't believe, I missed out on this whole thing. Everyone died, and then the books catch up to, well, no, the state of Israel lives on. So I really, was in this very strange bubble, being in the Cascade Mountains, off the grid. And my understanding of Judaism and Jewish people at that time was the survivors are in Israel. I didn't really have a concept of like.
Did you know there were any Jews in America?
Yeah, it just wasn't like, it just didn't seem likely.
Did you know there were any Jews around you, or did you not know that there were Jews? You thought all the Jews were in Israel.
There really, where we were, there really wasn't anybody. I'm sure in Seattle, for example, for us, like Seattle was like a 2-hour drive that you had to go to if, to fly. That was the only reason that anyone would ever go to Seattle. So I had no concept of it. And then I went to college. So I had a freshman year in college. All of a sudden there were all these Jewish people doing their Jewish thing. And, but it was Oberlin College in Ohio. So it's a very odd form of Judaism. And for me, it was all about getting to Israel. So I took.
When you said it was very weird Judaism, what do you mean by weird Judaism? What was weird about what you saw?
Well, ironically, I think a lot of it would have been stuff that my mother would have been very interested in, like, someone getting up and talking about menstrual blood for an hour as an empowering elixir of life or something at a Shabbat meal that was attended by 6 people, and someone played mandolin. It just wasn't. It didn't have. What I was interested in was a feeling of unbroken connection to that Tanakh, a 3,000-year chain, unbroken. And that's not what I was seeing at Oberlin. What I was seeing at Oberlin was people kind of like my mother, who just seemed to be kind of making things up, but they did throw in some Hebrew words, which was nice. But it wasn't for me. And so the first opportunity that I could, I went to Israel and basically spent a summer doing what I had learned to do growing up, which was hitchhike around, wander around, sleep on park benches, and I had very little money. And Israel was such an amazing experience to me. And I didn't go in with any conception that like I was going to be religious, nor did I understand any of that. But at one point I got to Kiryat Arba, which unfortunately is in the news right now. It was like a Friday midday, and they're like, "Oh, hurry up, the store is closing." And I'm like, "Why would the store be closing at 1 p.m. on a Friday?" And they're like, "Shabbos is coming, whatever." And suddenly I'm like, "Well, I got to get to the bus." And they're like, no, buses are done for the day. And classic Israel, people are very brusque and whatever. And then I'm like, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" And the next thing I know, there's like 2 guys in line in the store that are fighting over who's going to take me back with them to stay with their family for Shabbat, and there was a lot of that where I would like literally be sleeping on like a park bench, and someone would be like, "Asur lishon po, you can't sleep here," and yelling at me, and I'd be like, "Well, I don't have anywhere else to go." I'm just like, "Oh, you don't? Well, come back and stay with me," It's like, okay. So
did those Shabbat dinners or have any impact on you? Did they open up your eyes, or?
Oh, totally profound experience to be in a place. For example, Shabbat in Hebron, which was one of the first like religious Shabboses that I had, where I'm like in these stone buildings with like that are so ancient that they literally have like the mezuzah, carved into the stone, surrounded by olive trees in the hills of Judea, just and the singing and the davening that was unmistakably ancient and drawn right from these sources. So to me, it was very powerful, and I wasn't an unspiritual person. My mother is and was a very spiritual person, and I appreciated that spiritual aspect of things, of ceremony, but I just wanted ceremony that was meaningful to me, that felt real, and also that didn't feel like it was just made up by 3 people in their living room in 1978.
I just had one of our listeners in Israel just wanted to know if you ever had any connection with Shlomo Kaba, because he also was around that same time, and we had a spiritual movement. Did you have any connection with Reb Shlomo?
It's interesting. The first time that I heard about Reb Shlomo was that like he had passed. He was nifter. Like someone came and announced it, and everyone was like, "What?" And I was like, "Who? Wait, who?"
Where were you at that? That was 1993. Where were you at the time?
I was in Israel, I think. It was like, or it would right, something had happened right around then. It was 93.
94.
And then people would, I had a connection to him in that people would be singing, and they'd be like, "This is a Shlomo Nigun," or, I'd be like, "Wow, that really speaks to me." And then there was lots in those days, and I assume even today, there were lots of Shlomo stories that people were telling always, and there were these amazing, fantastical stories that sometimes involved people like me, these sort of very unlikely Yidden from the very edges of the earth who like somehow made their way back home. So those really resonated with me. And the fact that was kind of wild that Shlomo in his heyday, I think was like 3 blocks from the Coven of Witches where I was born in San Francisco, in the Haight-Ashbury.
Oh, you were that close to Shlomo, but you didn't know who he was at the time, but you're literally 3 blocks away.
Yeah, I had to go like 18 years to come back to him, but yeah.
That was the House of Love and Prayer in San Francisco that he had.
Exactly.
Amazing. So here you are, you're in Israel, you're invited for Shabbos. So how did you end up becoming an observant Jew?
Yeah, so that first experience was just sort of like all that did for me was like, I got to come back here. Again, really not a focus on America. So the next summer I came back, and then I did my junior year abroad, and then went back for yeshiva. But I ended up spending a lot of time in the Old City. Jeff Seidel at the Kotel, Rabbi Gil Locks, Gutman Locks, who would have me for Shabbos a lot and argue with me about God and various things. And then I ended up staying at the Heritage House in the Old City, and then going to this Aish Torah program. And that was awesome. And I think the thing that was so astounding to me coming from the American West was just this just open and endless hospitality of people being like, oh, you don't know how to, you don't know how to daven, you don't know what mincha works, come to my house and we'll eat and I'll like show you, and that was just happening constantly with these host of just hospitable characters. And in the American West, if you're wandering around the American West, your preoccupation is, am I trespassing? And if so, is someone going to shoot me like right away? I mean, that's what hospitality is in the American West. So for me, it was just, I was literally sometimes moved to tears, but just so overcome with it all. And the other thing, and it sounds funny, I guess, but I have a certain look physically that growing up in Norwegian dairy farming communities in Washington State made me kind of look like the odd guy out, And in Israel, there was something about people like assuming that I was Jewish, knowing that I was Jewish, assuming I was Jewish, speaking to me in Hebrew on site. For me, was a big thing. It was a sense of recognition and a sense of family, because I had no family, right? I had no father. I had this single mother. There was no siblings. There was no one else around. Suddenly, the sense of like, hey, I'm part of these people, and they recognize that I am.
Do you have any aunts or uncles or any other family members?
No.
Nothing.
Nothing.
So you have no cousins, nobody at all. It's just you and your family right now.
Yeah, thank God. I mean, my great grandfather, my mother's grandfather, who was the last sort of observant Jew, whose tefillin I got, whose talis I got, whose kippah I got his.
How you got it from your mother, or you got him from?
I got it from my grandmother, from my mother's mother. He had 3 daughters, like I do, and of those 3 daughters, there was only one grandchild. It was me, So I was sort of the sole heir of Grandpa Ellie's stuff and his
So
tradition.
when did you meet your grandmother or have a connection?
I met her a few times. She, my mother hated her. They had a very difficult relationship, and every once in a while, my mother would need to bail somebody out of jail or buy something desperate to survive, and she would have to swallow her pride and go to a payphone and place a collect call, and her mother would wire her some money. And when that happened, part of the deal was that her mother got to come visit us. And my grandmother would show up. She would bring her own portable commode, as she called it, because she was so horrified by our outhouse wherever we were. She'd have her commode. And her visit would always be like planned for a week, and then it would flame out after like 3 days as the fireworks combusted between her and my mother.
Was she religious?
She not a religious woman. She had grown up in a religious household, and so years later, before she passed, I was really pleased. I was able to go with my wife and visit her, and we were there for Shabbos. And she came out and she was like, benchlicht, and she had like her candles, and she had all these Yiddishisms that she was throwing down that we didn't even understand.
When she came to visit your mother in the times that your mother needed money, did you have any Jewish conversations with her, or it wasn't a part of your radar at that point?
I mean, I was pretty young. I had some Jewish conversations with her. I mean, she's a fascinating mind, but at the time I didn't even understand, what she was talking about. So I remember one of her big things was Hannibal invaded Rome. And she at one point grabbed me, Joshy, can you imagine if Hannibal had won, we would have had a Semitic Europe, not a Roman Europe. And this whole thing, and I was like, okay, I don't even know what you're talking about. But she had this sort of deep, and she was very into, everybody in the American West, there's a lot of proselytizing. She was very into sort of not proselytization and being proud. But she was also like a communist. So she had her own, she also told great stories about Stalin, so it was hard to pick, that wasn't a role model for me, really.
Did Chabad have anything to do with influencing you at all? Or you did it through Eshet Torah and other sources?
Yeah, it was Eshet Torah, and the guy who really, who had the biggest effect on me was a rabbi named Rabbi Raphael Weingart, who had come from the Far Rockaway Shar Yeshuv yeshiva and the Rav Freifeld Derech, and had opened up a yeshiva in Sfat. And that yeshiva I went to, called Shalom Rav, really sort of changed my world, and Rav Weingart really changed my world, because I was the kind of guy that he was in business for. He loved it. He loved it. He would come in, and a lot of other places, you open your mouth at a Shabbos table and you start talking about witches or something, some people freak out. They're like, "What's what? This is Lashon Hara, or what are you talking about? Or don't the kids are here, or whatever." And I get it. That's fine. But that's my truth. And so Rav Weingart was like, "This is amazing. Tell me more." And his whole thing was like, I would love to have, former drug addicts or drug addicts come here. I would love to have people who serve time in prison. I would love, whatever it was. He was like, "That's awesome. Let's make Shabbos together and sing, and we'll learn, and we'll do some davening." That was his whole thing. So it was a real mitzvah, and he sort of opened his home to me, and just sort of was infinitely tolerant with my, because I was sort of a guy who had learned very intense. I knew when I showed up in yeshiva, I knew how to daven, I knew how to do certain things, but I had really had no learning at all. I was really struggling just to learn Gemara and those kind of things. And so he was like, "Great, let's figure it out. Let's learn together." And
our guest is Josh Safrin. A fascinating story. His mother was a witch. He was a warlock. Now he's a Yidlock. And we're looking at his spiritual odyssey.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Josh Safrin is our guest. He's a author a while back. It's called Free Spirit, Growing Up on the Road and Off the Grid. And he was formerly a warlock. His mother is a witch, and he's a Yidlock. So how did your mother take, Josh, to the fact that you're not a warlock, you're religious, have an organized religion, the religion that she ran away from and didn't want any part of it? How did she react to it?
She, like I said, she was hesitant. She was unexcited about it. And then she came to visit me in Israel, and she came for Pesach, and we were talking about Shlomo Carlebach. So we went to Moshav Mavo Modi'in, the Carlebach Moshav, and we were there. I can't remember precisely when we were there, but at some point we were doing Kiddush Levana. So we were outside dancing under the moon, and my mother elbows me and she goes, "Not that different from the coven." So I think for her, seeing the Jewish experience that I had been interested in, through my eyes, seeing me sort of grown to be a man and tanned and happy, and seeing the kind of people that I was hanging out with, she kind of turned a corner from that experience. And then, like me, my mother then went off and hitchhiked around Israel on her own.
Oh,
And she had been a real anti-Israel activist before that, and we would fight and argue. And she met up with a woman, an Israeli artist, and who took her back to her house in Kiryat Shmona, precisely at the time that a Katyusha rocket attack came in from southern Lebanon. And like all of Kiryat, it was a big one. All of Kiryat Shmona was evacuated out, and my mother was just thrown on the bus as yet just another refugee, right? It didn't matter that she'd only been in town for 2 hours. She was a refugee. And so she herself got to experience Israeli hospitality and medical personnel coming to check that she was okay. And she called her boyfriend back in the States later and said, I'm okay, I'm okay. And the boyfriend said, why would you not be okay? And she was like, well, the town that I was in was just like under a rocket barrage. And he said, no, there's no news of that at all in America. No, there's no coverage of that. It doesn't exist. And I think for her, that was the beginning of an awakening, because I think part of what was problematic for her about her Jewish identity was this idea that Israel's bad, right? And so she had this profound experience, which was, well, wait a second, like maybe the news we're getting back in Washington State isn't accurate about Israel. And she had this experience to sort of prove that. And then she went on her own. I'm proud of her. I mean, she went on her own journey of her own tshuva path. I mean, I would say my mother sort of today identifies as kind of a conservative Jew. And in fact, when we were living in the San Francisco Bay Area, there was the National Public Radio folks, the local affiliate, who would always have these crazy anti-Israel speakers. And every once in a while, you'd hear like, "Oh, we've got Miriam on the line," and I'd be like, "Hey, that's my mother."
And she called to support Israel on the
support Israel and tell.
Is she still a witch? Does she identify as a witch?
She doesn't identify as a witch anymore. And one of the things, Zev, that you'll appreciate is when she herself was looking back on her witch days, she was a witch, and then she was a part of a shamanic tradition, and then this has a Jewish identity now again today. But when she was looking back at her witch days, she realized that the leaders, the priestesses of these witch movements, were all Jewish women, and so many of the practices that they were using as part of the green magic community that she was a part of were like ripped right out of Haggadah or wherever. So that was a funny round trip ticket for her.
Is that interesting? By the way, I'm curious. As a witch or growing up as a warlock, did they celebrate Halloween?
Not Halloween per se, but we had Samhain and Beltane and these other sort of quasi-Celtic pagan holidays. So there was an aspect of, but Samhain was a very serious, that had to do with literally speaking to the dead and the holiday of the dead. It wasn't like candy, and my mother very much looked down on that. So
let's go.
There was a lot
of interesting. Let's go to Judy in Brooklyn. Thank you for waiting. Your question for our guest. Go ahead, Judy.
Hi, hello, Joshua.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Hi, can Joshua hear me?
He can hear you. Go ahead. You have to listen to the response from the radio, but go ahead. What's your question for Joshua?
That's not my question. Joshua, I want to tell you something. I'm listening to you, and I'm so moved by you and your experience and your stories, and to the point of tears. And the tears are tears of joy, because I am so happy for you, because this journey that you've been going through, all these trials and tribulations and finding yourself, I'm just so emotionally happy for you that you have found the best path to Hashem. And I really, really appreciate everything that you're saying. And I'm just curious, how did you become a lawyer? Where? In America? Or where did you get your degree? I'm impressed.
Thank you, Judy. Hearing your response to this story is part of the reason that I began telling it, because for so much of my life, both as in becoming Jewish, becoming religious, I had a lot of embarrassment, a lot of shame about these trials and tribulations that I went through. So, but ultimately I found that by telling them, I would inspire people, and that I would, people who themselves had secrets to share would feel empowered. So that's awesome. I ended up applying to law school at Berkeley from a cave in Sfat when I was in the yeshiva there, and I didn't know if I would get in. I didn't know if I would go if I did get in, but I did. I got in, and the way I tell it is, I think the Orthodox Judaism and the being a lawyer were the two aspects of my rebellion against my mother. I mean, every teenager has to rebel. So for me, those were my rebellions.
Well, you know what? I'm glad. It's very fun. You could use things for good and for bad. Any characteristic. So you used it in a way, but it worked out very well for you. And I really wish you all the best. And you're just a very impressive person, and I really appreciate it. Thanks, Zev, for putting him on.
No, thank you. We had him on a while back, but I said his story is so wonderful that we had to reshare it again. But thank you for a really great call. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here's an email question for you, and you can email us as well. Mavis writes, let me see what Mavis writes over here. And he goes, Joshua, what name are you called up to the Torah?
Yeah, so my Hebrew name is Yoshua ben Yeshayahu Yonatan. So it's Yoshua is my Hebrew name, and my mother's father's name, his Hebrew name was Isaiah Jonathan Yeshayahu Yonatan. So that's what
you get called because your father wasn't Jewish, so you used your grandfather's name to be called up.
Right. And that was a Rob Weingart decision sometime in the 90s that has always stuck.
Because you asked the question how you should get called up to the Torah.
Yeah, right. And originally I was like, I guess I just go by Avraham. They're like, well, if you were a ger, that would be Avraham, but your mother's, you're Jewish, your mother's Jewish, so this is the way we do it. I was like, all right. So I feel a connection. I never met my grandfather. He died before I was born, but I feel a connection with him because of that. So
no, it's a moving story. You went through a lot. It wasn't easy what you went through, and between the abuse and the keep moving and being no father figure. So it's just amazing how you're able to pull yourself up and straighten out your life and really accomplish something. In fact, that you're a lawyer, but you're also involved in lots of interesting causes too, correct?
Correct. There was actually
featured on television not too long ago as well.
Yes, and there's a film about a case that I did called Crime After Crime, and I spent with another lawyer, we spent 7.5 years working to free an innocent woman from prison who was convicted essentially for standing up and protecting herself from a pimp who was battering her. And we got her out of prison, and it's a very emotional story. It was on the Oprah Winfrey Network, and that sort of profiles the work that I do. And
what kind of law do you specialize in?
So I have sort of a day job law and a night job law. My day job law is mostly like California real estate, basically land use development, those kind of things. And then my night job is advocating for women who have been wrongfully incarcerated for killing their batterers. And that's something that I've been involved with for a long time. And is of all the miscarriages of justice, it's these women who are many of whom are now grandmothers, who defended themselves at a time when the law didn't recognize what we now call an intimate partner battering and its effects defense. Basically, a battered woman defends herself. At the time that most of these women who are in prison for life were convicted, there was no defense available to them. But under today's standards, these women probably wouldn't even be convicted at all. So there's a weird mismatch where women who wouldn't be convicted at all today, the same crime, women are in jail, are in prison for life. So I've been working on a lot of lobbying and legislation. In fact, New York, 2019, I think, finally passed their Domestic Violence Justice Act. So I got to be involved in that a little bit, just as a cheerleader, basically.
What made you decide, of all aspects of social justice, what made you decide to pinpoint this as opposed to maybe something maybe even more Jewish oriented?
Yeah, this aspect, I think, came from the fact that my mother was, systematically, horrifically abused in front of me when I was a kid. And I, have a lot of shame about the fact, when you're 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, you're seeing your mother beat up in front of you and you're not stepping in to defend her. As an adult, I can say, oh, well, I was so little. What could I have done to this guy? He was a military guy. He was tough and had bullet holes in his body and scars. What could I have done? But your emotional brain, is like, I'm a coward. I should have stood up to defend her sooner. It took me until I was 12 to do it. So I think part of the motivation in taking these cases has been to stand up for women who are in the position that my mother was in, now that I'm strong enough to do that in a way that's within the confines of the law, but also in a way that's meaningful and helping these women tell their story and get out of this, break this cycle of violence.
What did your wife think about your story? You obviously, it's a very intriguing story and unusual. I don't know how many other people were warlocks with a mother for a witch that became observant Jews. So, how did your wife relate to that, and how do your fans relate to that today?
Well, it's my wife. I'm very fortunate because you're right. I don't know how many people, especially in the From Orthodox world, would have tolerated that. But I was very lucky because there's at least one other person who's my beshert, who's my wife, who grew up not quite in the same situation that I did, but she grew up in Carmel Valley, California, in and out of hot tubs, doing a lot of rebirthing and meditation with, parents who were 1960s radicals themselves. And she had a similar sort of tshuva experience, went to Israel, was on a kibbutz and eventually became religious. And so we met at a Shabbos table in Berkeley, California. She actually had made Aliyah. She came back to visit. And we sort of immediately recognized that we shared like 27 different things that no one else at the table did. And it was a perfect match. I mean, they say part of finding your zivug is timing. And so I'm very blessed that particular Shabbat, I accepted that invitation. I went there, it was quite a match. And so my wife knows where I come from, knows that world. And I relate well with her family. She relates well with my mother. We're a very small clan of left coast, howl at the moon, radical Baal Tshuvas that came out of that.
Now, at what age did you finally make the metamorphosis to observant Jew from Warlock?
I was probably about 19 was when I was sort of like, okay, I'm like going to be Shomer Mitzvot and I'm going to keep kosher and these things, and that was the point in my life when I was living in Israel, and of course it's much easier when you're in Israel, I found. But that for me was the moment, and
it sounds like I'm wondering why you didn't make Aliyah. It sounds like you're the perfect couple to ride for Aliyah, right? Or
yeah, I mean, it goes back to Judy's question about the law school. So then I came for law school, and then things happen, and I wanted to be an upstanding member of society, and suddenly I'm a lawyer and I got an offer. I mean, my prior work experience had been working at a janitor to get through college, and harvesting peas, driving a giant combine to get, suddenly I get an offer at a top 20 law firm. They're going to pay me all this money, and there's all the gravitas and prestige. And there was a part of me that wanted that, this grubby urchin that lived on a tree stump. I wanted to go to the country club and win awards and hang out with fancy rich people. And and there's a part of me that really enjoyed that. And to some degree, I still enjoy a little bit of that. But it's a good question. The funny thing is that my wife and I used to joke that if we wanted our girls to be religious, all we had to do was tell them that they couldn't, and then they would rebel and go do it. So we didn't do that, but we must have done something right. So our 15-year-old, our youngest, just left and went to Israel. She's now living in Israel at the age of 15, going to a boarding school, and she's putting a lot of pressure on us to come. And I think we're excited. I think that's probably in the cards for us is to go back. And we've visited over the years, but something about, for me, wanting to come back and be successful on the West Coast, the place where I had been this ragamuffin, was a tikkun that I had to make.
What was your biggest challenge becoming an observant Jew?
Biggest challenge? I mean, in all honesty, for a variety of reasons, I think kashrut is something that I've always struggled with, both because we ended up in the American West, but also because the way that I viewed food as a kid. I've gained a lot of weight, and but we were food insecure. And I learned early
You
on.
hardly had what to eat when growing up food salad. You're running from place to place.
Yeah, we didn't have enough. I mean, at one time I ended up camping out under the table of a group of Hare Krishnas so that I could raid their rice supply. For me,
you wouldn't find any meat at Hare Krishna.
no, relatively kosher actually, other than the being offered to idols. But I mean, for me, it was like the rule was like, if there was food available, you would take it, hoard it, gorge on it, because you never knew when you were going to get food again. And so there's a point where my sort of desire to be an upstanding, successful American citizen, clashes with this, like, well, we're going to starve until we get to the next, town 3 hours from here that has a store that has some kosher products. There's a little bit of a dance, particularly in the American West, that has to happen with that.
Where in the American West do you live now?
We're actually up in Portland, Oregon. So
isn't there an Orthodox community? There's an Orthodox community there, right?
Yeah, it's the strange surprise. Where we live, there are 5 shuls, 4 of which are Orthodox within walking distance, and 3 Jewish day schools. And until recently, we had a number of kosher food options, but COVID killed them, like restaurants. So it's a nice little. It's very small. It's like very microscopic, but it has done a good job. We were able to raise our kids here and be able to walk, to show a little walkable community. And, I think our time has sort of come now here that, it's a little too small, I think, for what we need. But.
So you're going to make a move, it sounds like.
I think so. I got to figure out, I've been working remotely in California from Oregon, which COVID worked out nicely for that. We got to figure our thing. And I think spiritually, Israel, I mean, with all due respect to my fellow American Jews, and Lord knows I've been an American Jew for a long time, but there's something about celebrating Sukkot in Israel, or being in Israel, going to the hotel and being around Jews in who are all on the same page. And I mean, Yom Kippur in Israel, I mean, these are experiences that it's hard for us to replicate here. And I'm a very Tanakh-minded guy, and so if I can be around for like a harvest in Israel, that's a powerful thing, or to go to the city of David and be part of something. It's that connection that I think supercharges the soul, the Jewish soul.
You see Free Spirit, your book, ending up being a motion picture?
It's funny. I've had a couple conversations about that, and the last conversation that I had with a studio was actually that it would do well as like a TV series, like a Netflix series, because my life was episodic. Each chapter was a new cast of characters. We're moving on. I got to work on that again. And I actually had some women approach me from Miami who had funded a film, who they thought it would be a great Broadway musical. And I was like, awesome. So I've had a lot of homework to sort of for the next phase of the book and of that story. And to be honest with you, that sort of the day job lawyering has interfered with it, but it's all on the list.
So who do you want, if it gets to be made a motion picture, who would you like to play Josh Safrin?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, at this, like a sort of a Timothy Chalamet type, someone with, big eyes and curly hair who's can look kind of like,
I want to thank you for listen. It's an amazing story, what you went through, and the trials and tribulations and deprivations and abuse. And today you're, thank God, successful. You have a wonderful, observant Jewish family. You're committed, and you've actually changed your mother's life too, because where it was unstable, now it's much more stable too. So you really accomplished. You have no relatives, but I think Abraham Lincoln said it's not important who your ancestors are, but who your descendants are. And I think that you are doing that. So kudos to you. Congratulations on what you're doing, and continued success.
Amen. Thank you.
And I'm waiting for the movie, either Netflix or movie, but it should definitely be out there.
Amen. I'm working on it.
Josh, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Shabbat tov.